Thank you again for joining us. I will now turn it over to Mr. Scott Pestridge, Senior Policy Advisor with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Sterling, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and we really are looking forward to a really solid event today, and thanks again for your time. My name is Scott Pestridge. I'm with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, as Sterling mentioned, a Senior Policy Advisor. I just wanted to mention briefly that this is National Gang Violence Prevention Week, and on behalf of our administrator, Karen Harp, we definitely want to echo the sentiments that issued by President Trump in the proclamation recognizing September 15th to the 21st as National Gang Violence Prevention Week. And it's dedicated to combating violence in communities nationwide and supports the Department of Justice's work with state, local, and tribal law enforcement partners to implement Project Safe Neighborhoods, which, as many of you know, is a data-driven, comprehensive violent crime reduction program. So I just wanted to, you're welcome to look at some resources. We have the proclamation and the resources listed on our ojjdp.gov website. There's an In Focus page on gang violence prevention, which highlights the comprehensive gang model as well as the proclamation and many activities that we've endeavored with the National Gang Center over the course of these many years. I wanted to just preface this webinar with the fact that although this webinar is called Recognizing Gang Activities in Schools, we actually had a webinar in early August in collaboration with our National Gang Center around responding to gangs in schools, creating a collaborative process between schools and law enforcement. And we realized that it would be incumbent upon us to assist jurisdictions in helping to identify when gang activity is happening in schools. So this is the second part of that series. You're welcome to find the initial portion on our, it's cataloged in our ojjdp.gov website. I do want to state that we have been, in this fiscal year, we're supporting as an office many gang initiatives, and I just wanted to bring them to everyone's attention real quick. Programs around youth gang assistance and diversion, as well as youth gang suppression, and supporting victims of gang violence as well. And certainly we continue our support for the National Gang Center because it's a vital component of disseminating information, knowledge, and outcome-driven practices that engage and empower those in local communities to create comprehensive solutions to prevent gang violence and to suppress gang-related crime. So we've worked with the National Gang Center since 1995 when it was started as the National Youth Gang Center, and in 2009 it was merged to become the National Gang Center. So I just wanted to mention a little bit of historical context there. Nina, the director of the National Gang Center, is going to give a little bit of context momentarily around just around this particular webinar, but I do want to just briefly highlight the esteemed panelists that we have today. We have the Deputy Commissioner of the Delaware Department of Corrections and retired Lieutenant Colonel of the Delaware State Police. That's Monroe Hudson from Delaware, Dover, Delaware, and he's going to be speaking and really looking forward to his perspective, law enforcement perspective around this very important issue. And then we're going to hear from an individual that has a ton of knowledge working with communities around gang violence and gang-related issues, and that's Victor Gonzalez, and he's Director of Program Services out of the Mayor's Anti-Gang Office in Houston, Texas, and we've had the opportunity to train with him in the past as well, so we're appreciative to have him on board. And then finally, Mina Harris, who's the Director of the National Gang Center, and certainly has been a tremendous support to our office in providing support over the years. Without her support, frankly, we would not be in a position to be able to effectively manage programs nearly to the extent that we have. So we really appreciate that support. So I think you have a really balanced approach here today between practitioners, law enforcement, and kind of research disseminators, if you will. So I think it's going to allow for a tremendous opportunity for engagement and questions, specifically around recognizing gang activities in schools. So with that, I turn it over to Mina Harris, the Director of the National Gang Center.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join our webinar. As Scott had mentioned, this is the second webinar of a two-part series about gangs in schools. In the first webinar last August, we discussed sound practices to develop collaborations among school administrators, law enforcement, and other community-based organizations to address gang activity in schools. To set the stage, we discussed national indicators regarding the presence of gangs in schools, but stressed the need for focusing on local assessment and patterns of activity among students thought to be gang involved. Today, we have three objectives that will be touched upon by both presenters. First, although gang indicia are very localized, there are some gang identifiers and behaviors demonstrated by youth that are recognizable. Teachers do not have to be experts, they just need to know enough to recognize the issue. Second, diagnosing the actual gang problem in an individual school is paramount to developing an adequate response. The presenters will discuss some formal and informal techniques for assessing the level of gang activity in and around a school. Third, the presenters will discuss a data-driven framework to contain the spread of gang-related activity, mitigate risks that foster gang activity, and protect those who are most vulnerable in the school setting. Next. So for more information about ways to respond to gang activity in schools, check out our Gangs in Schools Guide on the National Gang Center website.
Great. Thanks,
Okay.
Nina.
For just one more. For on this last slide that I've got, for educators, parents, students, law enforcement, and everyone else who cares about the people in a school setting, school safety, it's of utmost importance. School shooter incidents dominate the media for very good reason, but they are only one piece of what affects school safety, positive school climate, and the learning environment that educators are responsible for. These 5 action items listed under our Making Schools Safer acronym in this slide are meant to frame the bigger strategy of responding to gangs in schools. So as you listen to the 2 other presenters, you will hear key points that go back over and over again to these 5 items: sharing gang intelligence and information, holding key stakeholders accountable for their responsibility in the response plan that's created, fostering an environment of trust across all stakeholders, educating stakeholders, and creating gang suppression response strategies that are appropriate for the situations in your school and your school district. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Victor Gonzalez, who will talk about identifying gang-involved teams.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for visiting today. We're going to talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to give it from the perspective of all the years that I've been out here doing this. Certainly, I'm sure a lot of you are experts in your area already. And some of the first things that I'm looking for when I'm on a campus is I'm looking for something visible. A lot of times with my gangs here in Houston and across the state of Texas, we may see specific colors. And then there may be a color combination from the shirt, the cap, the belt, and all the way down to the shoes, as you see in this picture here. And sometimes people look at it, it's a fashion deal. It's not a big deal that has to do anything with gangs. And you need to revisit that because these types of things are very visible for kids, especially the rivals, and when they see these things, it can stir up a lot of tension on a campus. One of the other things I'm looking for is when I'm interviewing some of the kids or talking to some of the kids, or if there's some things administrators have picked up, like these knowledge books, the notebooks there on the screen, there's gang knowledge in there. This young man in the middle with the picture of Silent and SPPL on his hand is actually his nickname in the gang he belongs to, and then just a plain, simple tattoo on this young lady's neck gives us her nickname. So sometimes those things are out there, they're very visible, and you're able to go in a good direction. And if you know what's going on, the kids are real likely to have a conversation with you because you're a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to gangs. The biggest thing that you start to see that's a presence of gangs in a community and in these campuses is obviously graffiti. The picture in the middle is some stuff that a kid was drawing while he was supposed to be doing classwork, and he loves art, so he eventually started to tag his gang name, his gang neighborhood, some signs and symbols that come with that. And then obviously there's stuff that sits out plain as day, 5'9" Pyru or Black Disciples. However, in that Black Disciple, the numbers 2, 15, and 9 stands for Brothers of the Struggle. And when you get to 7, 4, that's GD for Gangster Disciples. And then obviously the 6 is going to represent the 6-pointed star. But the black and blue gives you a real indication of what colors they may be using on the campuses. So those things are real crucial in trying to see what you have on your campus. Amongst the students, obvious hand signs and handshakes and throwing of gang signs. Lots of times in the hallways, these things are taking place, and we don't really say anything. And I know nowadays there's a lot of handshakes where kids are going back and forth with each other. They mimic a lot of what's going on in sports, or maybe something that's going on in entertainment and music. There's a lot of things that are happening that influence this. So you need to be real careful that you're not just calling everything gang-related, especially when it comes to handshakes. Because in these pictures you see the first two, there's evidence of the bandanas and the belts that are pretty evident. But when you get to the Instagram posts, there's no colors there. There's just straight hand signs. And so you got to be careful that you're not just always calling somebody a gang member based on some things you may see. But it's a good indicator that you need to check it out and see exactly what's going on your campus. The behaviors, when you start to get into those, you have to really understand what's going on. So a lot of times when I walked on a campus and I'm meeting with administration for the first time, they have a tendency to talk about some of the things that have been going on prior to me getting there. And one of the things that I watched, I asked, do kids dominate an area? Do they congregate? And when they're in that area and they're congregating, whether they're in a hallway, or out by a bathroom, by a Coke machine, in a courtyard, are they doing certain things? Are they making comments? One of the biggest things I run across in some of my campuses that have Bloods on it, I always ask the administrators, have you ever heard Sue Whoop? And the first thing they say, yes, what is that? I said, that's a blood call. And once you hear that, sometimes it can cause friction between a crip set that's on there, and then they'll start making comments and they'll go back and forth, and then you start to see your posturing. People are going to start to throw up gang signs, make other comments, so that everything becomes verbal. And then once they start posturing and it starts to get a little loud, you're going to end up having some fights. And so you've got to be real careful with that, because lots of times I've seen it on campuses and they just think, well, they're just being kids. They're just making noises. They're a little rowdy today. Don't pay too much mind to it. It'll go away. You got to be real careful with those types of comments or attitudes, because you can't underestimate where these kids are coming from. Because once they get going and they're set on your campus, and we're not paying attention to it, things can get out of hand pretty fast, pretty quick. Techniques for identifying these youth involved in this activity. Probably one of the biggest things that I'm going to stress is you've got to have a relationship. Everything that I do around gangs and with these kids is I have to have a relationship with them. And the way you do that, if I'm new to a campus, you've got to get out there and say hello. You got to get out there and shake hands. I always look at administrators and counselors and what other folks are on campus that can help me build the relationships with the kids when I'm first coming in. Because when you first come in, I'm doing the gang outreach. I'm an outsider. I'm coming in as a vendor, a contracted person to come in and help them with their situation. The kids don't know me, so immediately they're kind of like, what is he doing in the hallways? Who is he? He's probably 12. You know, they're calling me a cop already. He's a cop. He's undercover. He's this and he's that. And it isn't until you get on the campus and you start creating those relationships and you start breaking down some of those comments, they're going to start to realize, okay, he's there for a reason. So he's here. What's up with him? And because I know my information around gangs in that specific area, it really helps to kind of ease the tension between myself and a group or a student. I think one of the biggest mistakes I've watched happen many times is that administrators, when they're trying to address this gang activity, they get very confrontational, and it's in front of everybody. And in the day and ages of technology and these phones, the sooner you give a gang member a place to dance and make a scene, he's going to make one, especially if his friends are there. If his homeboys are around and you're disrespecting him, you're being loud, these things get really, really serious in a hurry, because now it starts to become an issue of disrespect. And so you want to make sure that when you're addressing that stuff, take it behind closed doors. You don't have to be so loud about it. Pull him to the side, get in his ear, look, we need to talk, what's going on? Because at the end of the day, if you don't understand what's happening on your campus, it's going to be hard to deal with. And these kids, believe it or not all of them are going to want trouble. You know, some of them are on probation. Some of them maybe have some court hearings that are pending. He may make just a simple promise to his mom, I'm not going to cut up, Mom, but you've got to be able to support that. So checking in with these kids is really, really important in checking in with these guys to actually see what is going on with them. Who are they? What are they about? Because on the outside, you'll see this uniform and you'll see this gang stuff all out in front of you with the bandana and the belt if you allow that on your campuses. But once you get involved with them and you start to work with them, there's another person there. There's another person that sometimes you don't know on that campus. And there's a lot of things that are going on. I've got a lot of kids that are not special ed kids. They're very smart. I got a pre-AP kid yesterday involved in an incident. But when I started to talk to him behind the scenes, he's got a lot going on at home. And the kids that are pressuring him on campus are giving him a hassle. So now he feels he's on the fence with, do I join the gang or not? But because of the fight he had, he felt I had to. I'm being bullied. I've got to stand up for myself. I'm going to claim a gang that I'm not in, but I'm going to have to take that step because I'm tired of these guys bullying me. So until I got involved, then I started to understand everything that was going on with him. And the administrators started to tell me, hey, he's in pre-AP classes. He's a pretty smart kid. But this pressure that he's feeling from school and at home is causing a lot of issues. So make sure that when you're dealing with these kids that you're really getting down to the bare bone of what's really going on. Because what starts to happen with that is that this information that you're going to need is so valuable to the school and your overall policies and strategies in dealing with the gang activity on the campus. You need to realize that a lot of times you may be one of those folks that are very proactive on your campus and you're willing to get involved with this population and understand your real gang situation. And I think what starts to happen is that when you have that information, you know, what do you do with it? And I think one of the first things that I suggest to schools lots of times is what is your information sharing protocols in the school? And everybody's a little bit different. You have crisis response strategies usually in place, but how do we gear it for gang, and what does it entail? And a lot of times I've watched where teachers are sometimes I get this information, I don't know what to do with it. I get school counselors where I can only go this far, Vic. I don't know where else to go with this information. It has to do with gangs. I'm concerned for my student, but what do I do with it? Because when you have the right people in place, you can help prevent quite a bit of things on your campus if you're proactive. Being reactive, to me, we're just always going to be behind the 8 ball all the time, and that's not good. So every time you have somebody that is on your campus that is willing to dip with this population, you want to do the best you can to bring them together and map out what sharing protocols are going to be. If you're having service providers coming from the outside, they're also going to need to know what's going on and what's happening inside your school because we're guests. I come on as a guest with these schools, and I have to understand how they want to operate. Because at the end of the day, the best resource for information is from your students and the people that work on that campus. You can't share anything you don't have. And so the biggest thing to me is that if you're in that mix and you're getting involved and you're working this population, they're going to talk about things. Things are going to come out, and it's going to be a huge help to everybody on the campus. I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is to hold kids accountable in a different way. You can suspend and do what you have to do when it's necessary, but there also has to be some other small things that we can do to hold these kids accountable. There's a lot of times where a lot of my kids don't even know what the school policies are regarding gang activity. A lot of my kids don't even know how many credits we have. They don't even know what classes they're supposed to be taking. And when they're not connected to the school and they're not feeling that anybody is really taking a good look of what's going on the campus for gang activity, why should I care? You know, Vic, nobody says anything. I brought up a situation of another person, but nobody on this campus seems to care. Nobody on this campus seems to have done anything to understand what our gang situation here is here. So why should I care, Vic? You know, I'm 17. I'm still in the 9th grade. I don't even know what's up with this credit recovery thing they keep talking about. I don't understand how all that works. And when you're having conversations with these kids along what those policies are and what academic issues that they're missing, it's important that you talk about that, but also hold them accountable for those things too. because at the end of the day, they want to start blaming anybody and everybody for what it is that they didn't get. And it's important to know that you're supporting them, because once we start to figure out who your players are, you need to figure out how are we going to help these kids, which kids are going to get rid of themselves by breaking policy, and which kids are going to drop out, because a lot of that starts to happen with a lot of my gang kids. But if you're being consistent with prevention, intervention, and suppression techniques with these students, and not just my gang kids, but everybody that's on that campus, it's going to make it a safer place. And then coordination is going to be so key in getting this thing up and running the way you want it so that you can have a good year. I've watched schools that kind of start to scramble. By the time I'm there, we're scrambling and they're trying to figure all this stuff out. And it's one of those things that we got to pull all the right people together to make sure this thing rolls out. And every campus is going to know who those people are and create that small team. I try to put stuff in perspective. I'm very visual. I start to see my process in my head when I came on first years ago doing this work in schools on a consistent basis for the last 15 years as a contractor. I was like, who can I put in place, who's available? And the one thing that I really was focusing on when I was doing my part, when you look at the gang intervention services, my role was to monitor those students, get involved with those students, figure out who they were, what was going on, what's the information activity, what's the soap opera on campus. That's the biggest thing I'm trying to figure out, because once you know what's going on, who doesn't like who and why, you're able to head a bunch of stuff off at the path and be very proactive. The grades, attendance, and behavior, I'm telling you, I'm not trying to overstate or exaggerate, but a lot of my guys and girls, they don't keep up with their grades and their attendance. You ask them, and they will turn around and say, I know I'm passing this class, but I don't know about my other one. Well, I do homework sometimes. Sometimes I'm asleep because it's early in the morning. I didn't get no sleep. So a lot of times there's so many things that are going on with these kids that we don't understand, and I'm that person that has to bring it to light. When we get to administration, the prevention and intervention piece to me, that's where they're going to deal a little bit. They have to deal with discipline, the parents, making sure the policies and consequences are handed out appropriately. Those kinds of things really need to play a focus in how we're going to bring this to the light with the parents and the child. A lot of times I try to encourage my schools, call the parents every now and then for some good stuff, not just because they're always in trouble. I think sometimes it helps because now we can get that buy-in from parents to come in, because a lot of times they see their phone blowing up, like it's a school, I ain't answering it. And I think the biggest thing is that we want to build that bridge with the families to make sure that we're getting everything that we can for this kid, because at the end of the day, the kids, family dysfunction or not, they love their families and they love their parents. They just struggle with everything that they have going on. When we get into gang prevention stuff, I started to look at if there was a mentoring group, if there's a counseling component on campus, what supportive services can those folks give? Because sometimes they get stuck with the gang intervention piece. And so I have to work with them to kind of guide them and walk them through how to handle a situation with a young person, because that young person may have brought up something about a drive-by shooting, or they got jumped, or something happened that they're worried about retaliation, and the school-based counselor sometimes doesn't always understand how that works. So I have to fill that gap along with law enforcement and the administrators in that situation, because there's got to be protocol, there's got to be a process. With police, I'm really trying to bridge gaps between the students and the campus officers. So campus officers to me are real crucial in how they're welcoming kids, how they're doing their job. The kids know they're there for a reason. A lot of my gang kids, they're like, hey, Vic, I already told officer such and such. I already let her know what's up. I let him know what's going on. He was cool. He talked to me. And the biggest thing that comes out is that then the kids will tell me they're approachable. I could approach them. I could talk to them. They listen to me. They respected me. They know what I bang, but they're not giving me any hassle. So, I feel comfortable with them, because at the end of the day, Vic, I can't get in no trouble. I'm on probation. I don't want to get kicked out. My mom's about to have, a set of twins, and I don't want to bring no more drama to the family. So there's a lot of little things that go on that we don't always understand. Probation officers equally. I mean, I feel the more you can have a probation officer, ours are very proactive here in Houston. I've been across other parts of the country where it's criminal justice. I got to do what I got to do. But I think you guys play a good role if we're all working together to be able to explain what probation does and why certain things don't happen when the outsiders like me or a counselor or an administrator doesn't understand, why isn't this kid off my campus? Why wasn't he arrested? Why wasn't this? Why wasn't that? And I think a lot of times what starts to happen is that when as agencies and as groups that are trying to work with this thing, this gang activity on these campuses, it allows you guys to be able to break down some barriers and maybe discuss some of the challenges that you have in your respective roles in dealing with students, dealing with young people and violence in whatever city you're in. I know it gets difficult because even when I first came into this, I wasn't really trusting the police. I wasn't really trusting the probation. When we started to implement the comprehensive gang model in Houston back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we still use a lot of the concepts today. And as long as everybody stays in their role and everybody works together, I found things to move much smoother. And the kids actually were progressing a little bit more because of the additional support. We're not talking about giving kids so many breaks that they just think there are no consequences. I think you have to have a good balance. You can go all the way right and arrest your way and lock up everybody you want to, or you can try to go all the way left and say we're going to help every kid no matter what happens. But you can't do that, in my opinion, with a gang member. There's too many things that could happen. I've had good kids go bad really quick. I had one kid that was with us doing a project with senior citizens, preparing on Thursday. We're going to see you Saturday for the event. And on Friday night, he was robbing somebody because he got caught up with a friend, and he got shot up by an off-duty officer. He got hit 9 times, that fast, that quick. And we had done a lot of work with that kid. But he went and got high. He went and ran into a friend of his. He let that friend get in his head and convinced him to go out there and rob. And I lost that kid that fast, that quick. I think the biggest thing that we can do as practitioners is that we need to come together and we need to understand each other's roles. And so when I'm out there working on these campuses, I really try to make sense of it so that we're all on the same page doing what we can to help the kids that want to be helped. Those that don't, the regular consequences kick in, the discipline kicks in as it has to. Parents are already probably in the fold already because they've been called in so many times or contacted for the referrals to the office. But I think at the end of the day, when everybody comes together, we're better off. And these kids are going to be better off. And your campus is going to be much safer. Because at the end of the day, when the kids feel a lot of people are around them and a lot of kids are supporting, a lot of practitioners are supporting, and you're approachable and you can get there, and they can get to you, and you're going to receive them, you're going to welcome them, you're going to be respectful, but at the same time, I'm not playing with you, you already know what it is, and we can hold them accountable. You'd be surprised what comes out of their mouth and how they want to be safe on the campus as well, and gang activity is not as important as you thought.
Great. Victor, are you finished with your portion of the presentation?
I'm done. Yes, sir.
Oh, awesome. I thought that was a tremendous overview of the work that you've done within the City of Houston and more nationally and more broadly. And I really appreciate you bringing up your work with the comprehensive ODJDP's comprehensive gang model, and look forward to hopefully hearing more about that as we get to the Q&A portion of our afternoon agenda.
You're welcome.
So thanks again, Victor. And so now we're going to turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Monroe Hudson with the Delaware Department of Corrections and recently retired Lieutenant Colonel from the Delaware State Police. So Deputy Commissioner Hudson has been truly involved in law enforcement for a number of years, having served with Delaware State Police for 31 years. He oversaw the command staff that deployed school resource officers across 19 Delaware school districts for 138,000 students. So he has a sense of the mechanics of what goes behind deploying strategies around supporting youth in a school setting. So with that, we want to hear, please, I want to do due diligence to you, Monroe, in terms of providing background, but let's turn it over to you and hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to join us. It's much appreciated. This afternoon, I'm just going to provide you with a law enforcement perspective on recognizing and responding to gang activity within your school environments. So what is the role of law enforcement when we look at the comprehensive model? And really, I think the one thing that we have to put into perspective, it's not just a law enforcement problem. Law enforcement doesn't own this by themselves. We have to share the problem. We have to work together. We have to get all of our stakeholders involved, and this includes our social service providers, probation and parole, which Victor mentioned earlier, are key stakeholders, nonprofits who are willing to come out and support the school, and also our school administrators, our school staff have to play a critical role in this problem. So again, law enforcement can't own it by themselves. And we have to realize that we're not going to arrest our way out of the problem. Again, there's going to be times when an arrest is appropriate, and then we can leverage the criminal justice system to apply pressure for programming, but we're not going to arrest our way out of the problem. Too many times, and I'm sure if you're in law enforcement, you see, you make an arrest today, that same student's going to be back in the school tomorrow. So we have to look at other avenues to get that person into program and get them to support and hopefully deter them from gang activity. So the only true way for us to eradicate the gang problem is to take a collaborative approach with our stakeholders. If we can all work together, share information and resources, we can truly have a significant impact. So Victor mentioned this earlier, trust is absolutely paramount. Law enforcement has to start early, and we have to work with the school to develop that trust, both with the school administration, the school staff, and the students. The quicker we can build that trust, we're certainly going to open up the flow of communication and the sharing of information. So Victor mentioned this, my former agency, the Delaware State Police, has a school resource officer program. This is a great avenue for developing and fostering trust. The SROs are there for security, for a law enforcement function, but every day they're building relationships with the staff, with the administration, and with the students. Students are actually putting a name to the police officer, and that is important in terms of building that trust and building that information and communication flow. So if you're not fortunate enough to have an SRO program, my recommendation as a law enforcement executive is to look at other methods, whether that be regular meetings with your school staff, or just having a patrol officer or a patrol supervisor frequently stop by the school to have that interaction and develop those relationships. And again, to kind of wrap the roll up here, is we have to develop that trust, because that trust is going to pave the way to open communications. And law enforcement has to be engaged in all three aspects of the model: prevention, intervention, and suppression. So I think on your screen now you should see the model that kind of outlines the three-pronged approach. And if you look at law enforcement, as I previously mentioned, we have to play a role in all three prongs of the model. We'll start with the prevention strategies. Early on, this is where we can play a huge role, and our hope here is to prevent a juvenile from ever joining a gang. How do we do this? Gang awareness training is critical. If we can deliver subject matter expert training to our school resource officers, our security staff, school staff, parents, and guardians, we're going to be ahead of the curve. The training has to be realistic. It has to be related to gang trends in your specific area. And Victor said they vary from area to area, from state to state, so it has to be realistic. Law enforcement can take proactive steps to get more police officers in elementary schools and middle schools. I think nationally, if you look at stats, kids tend to join gangs around 14 or 15, so why not take a proactive step to try to get police officers in the elementary schools and in the middle schools, again, to join or to get that trust, build that trust, and build those relationships, and hopefully deter those kids from ever joining a gang. Your agency can consider implementing the evidence-based gang resistance education and training program, the GREAT program. Again, that's a great program aimed at prevention strategies. Or if your agency has a PAL, a police athletic league, something that you can offer after school and on weekends to keep the kids off the streets, that's a great resource for building trust, building relationships, keeping kids active and keeping them off the streets. So that's another great resource. If you're not that fortunate, you could partner with some other local communities like the Boys and Girls Clubs, have some programs there where your police can go in and actually work with the kids. And again, the focus here is trying to keep them involved and keep them off the streets. I think probably lastly, if you know you have a violence problem, a gang violence problem at the school or maybe on the path to school, it's important for law enforcement to make sure that the kids have a safe passage to and from school by adding extra resources along that path for suppression activities, and again, making sure that the kids can get to school safely. Moving on to intervention strategies, some things that we can do, and really this is where the team approach comes in, is sitting down at the table and figuring out which resources are available so that we can make those referrals. And again, it's not just a law enforcement problem, it's a team problem. We all have to work together. So if we truly know what everybody's role is, such as a school administrator, social service providers, probation and parole, from an intervention strategies perspective, we can make those appropriate referrals and hopefully get those kids the support that they need. Lastly, suppression strategies. And this comes back to the arrest component. Juveniles who commit serious physical assaults, sexual assaults, and other acts of violence, they have to be held accountable. And this is where we're going to have to leverage the criminal justice system to mandate the appropriate programs for the offenders. There's no way around that. There's times when we have to make an arrest, and that's part of law enforcement's function, and that is a critical function. But for minor violations and minor victimless misdemeanors, we could consider leveraging civil citations in lieu of a criminal arrest. Some advantages of this: it diverts the youth from the criminal justice system. It helps families identify and address youth needs and available programs. And it also allows law enforcement to focus on more serious offenses. So it keeps our law enforcement officers free. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an assessment. Probably important, what is an assessment? We'll define it first and then talk about what a well-prepared assessment looks like. So an assessment is nothing more than a comprehensive study using various data sets to determine the size, scope, and nature of a gang problem. There's a lot of resources that we can use to gather this information, but again, I'm going to stress that it's not just a law enforcement function. This has to be a team approach because we all have data that can help build this comprehensive roadmap to determine the size and the scope of our gang problem. So resources that we can use: historical law enforcement crime reports, incident reports, intelligence reports, real-time crime data. On the school administration side, school disciplinary referral reports, and obviously probably more important, personal observation of gang activity in or around your school, tagging, criminal mischief, etc. And I think as part of the research model specific to a school, I think it's also important that we look at the community around the school, because certainly if we have gang problems, juvenile gang problems occurring in the community, you can bet that they're also going to spill over into the schools. So I think it's important that your comprehensive study also look at your surrounding community to see what impact that's going to have on the school environment. So why is an assessment important? A well-prepared assessment should serve as a blueprint or a playbook for the allocation of resources. So really it's going to drive your decision making in terms of resource allocation, your personnel, the equipment that you're going to need, and probably more importantly, it's going to drive your budget decisions. If you're going to apply for a grant, a nice comprehensive study is going to help you hopefully receive that grant. Or also if you're doing a presentation before your city manager or your town council or your city council, that's certainly going to be an aid to have a nice comprehensive report to show exactly the size and the scope of the problem. So what are you trying to answer from the assessment? And really it comes back to, from a law enforcement perspective, the basics, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. We talked about this previously: the size, the scope, and nature of the gang problem on the school grounds and in the neighboring communities. From my perspective, I want to know the number of gangs, the number of gang members in each gang. Do we have any known rivalries? What are the gang names, signs, symbols, markings? Victor talked a lot about this in terms of signs, symbols, and markings. Do we have any documented violence associated with these gangs that may spill over into the school environment? And then what are some of their trademark crimes? Is it just tagging? Is it criminal mischief, property damage, property crimes? Are there other more serious crimes such as robbery or auto thefts? So the answer to these questions really, they're going to drive the decision-making model in the future as we allocate those resources and try to secure funding. So recognizing and identifying gang activity, I think Victor did an excellent job of talking about this, so I'm not going to rehash talking about the signs, the symbols, colors. But one thing I wanted to hit on is nationally we're seeing these pop-up gangs, and I know in Delaware we've been seeing them where there are street-level gangs, and they may not be, they're much more hidden. They may not have the colors, they may not have the signs. And the one thing that we're also seeing, there's no allegiance to a specific gang. They may be in one gang 1 month and 2 months later jump over to another gang. So they're much harder to identify. So what can we do, or what methods can we use to identify some of these gangs? And again, it goes back to using real-time crime data, analyze historical and current crime trends, looking for trends of gang violence. Again, we talked about the tagging, the street robberies, auto thefts. What are we seeing daily? What are we seeing monthly in terms of that historical crime? Analyze other law enforcement records to include your records management systems that may contain gang-related identifiers, such as field interviews, traffic stops, etc. Also look at some of your crime intelligence reports or your gang intelligence reports. What's the intelligence telling us? And a great way to track gang activity is covertly monitoring social media accounts, those that are open for public view. And then lastly, personal observations within the community and the school environment. So how do we validate a gang? So this could vary from state to state. You may have state laws, you may have county laws, you may have city ordinances. So I won't get into specifics, but really the validation process, again, comes back to the collection of information from a variety of resources. It usually includes, again, police reports, some of your crime intelligence reports, social media posts, covert police activities, meaning surveillance, personal observations from being out in the community, confidential trusted sources, and Department of Correction records. And typically, if you look across the country, a lot of the techniques involved, and again, this comes down to statutes or laws to define a gang. 3 or more persons are involved. Obviously, to validate a gang, you have to have a criminal predicate in order to collect and store intelligence information on a gang. Looking for a common gang name or other identifying signs, symbols, tattoos, markings, graffiti, or attire. Does the police department or does law enforcement have any documented reports, any photographs, video, or social media sites indicating gang activity, and a confirmation of signs, symbols, tattoos, markings, and attire? Intelligence developed by trusted confidential sources, and probably the easiest one for us here in Delaware, self-admitted gang member is an automatic validation technique. But a lot of agencies or a lot of states require maybe 2 or 3 of these in order to check off to validate a gang. We talked about the various statutes. I know in Delaware, a juvenile gang is defined as 3 or more persons with a gang name or other identifiers which either promotes, sponsors, assists in, participates in, or requires as a condition of membership submission to group initiation that results in any felony or any misdemeanor. And when I went out on the National Gang Center website, I think there's a listing out there of other state statutes. So Delaware statute is very similar to many other state statutes. So how can law enforcement work with school personnel and youth service providers to share information? I know Victor touched on this a little bit. I can't stress enough how information sharing is absolutely critical. We have to share information across all disciplines. That includes the school, social service providers, probation and parole, law enforcement, and the community leaders. We have to share information across all disciplines. And building that trusted relationship is critical to communications. And I hit on that much earlier in my presentation. The sooner that we can get into schools and we can build those relationships, the communication is going to open up, and that is very, very important. So in full disclosure, I know sometimes information sharing gets a little tricky for law enforcement because most states have laws that prohibit the dissemination of criminal history information and or the dissemination of criminal intelligence. So I would suggest early on that you get all the stakeholders at the table, you get your attorneys involved and figure out what, based on your state statute or your local laws, what exactly you can share. And that's important to do that early on. But there's definitely, in terms of the risk for public safety, there are workaround solutions So you got to get to the table and have that discussion. So sharing between disciplines, how can we do that better? I think informally, law enforcement and school administrators have to be able to call each other. And going back to the SRO program, having an SRO in that school, having those relationships built, that should happen every single day. The school staff should be able to pick up the phone and call the SRO after hours to be able to report activity or concerns. The same for the school resource officer. Evening hours should be able to call the school staff. So that line of communication should be established and should be open 24 hours a day. Formally, I would suggest regular sit-down briefings on a weekly basis where information can be exchanged between the stakeholders and law enforcement and school administrators. So how can we share better between law enforcement agencies? I think law enforcement overall, we've come a long way since 9/11, but we certainly still have room for improvement. We still have those silos of information, and sometimes we still have those breakdowns in sharing. So it's not uncommon, as most of you know, for a school district to, where a school district resides, could be contained within many law enforcement jurisdictions. So the information sharing between those law enforcement agencies and the school is critical. And that's sometimes where we see that breakdown. So how do we do a better job of sharing that information between jurisdictions? And again, it's back to having trusted relationships with our surrounding law enforcement agencies, promoting the use of a statewide or regional criminal intelligence database. If your law enforcement doesn't have access to a database, there are some resources out there through Risk Intel or Risk Gang that's at no cost to your agency at all, and it's a great way to share criminal intelligence. Also, regional meetings with law enforcement stakeholders to share case information and criminal intelligence is very important. And having a mechanism in place for immediate notification for issues that create a public safety risk. It's great to collect intelligence. It's great to put it into a system. It does no good if the receiving agency doesn't get it until 24 hours later. So if it's something critical to public safety, that information has to be shared promptly. Whether that's picking up the phone and calling the agency, whether it's some type of public safety app that you use in your agency, that communication has to occur, and it has to occur rapidly. I'll use a case example in Delaware of a fight that occurred at a school. The fight was contained, safety was secure, or was quickly restored at the school. But what we didn't realize, going back to the fact that kids were bussed into the school from other jurisdictions, is the need to reach out to those jurisdictions by phone or by some type of application, public safety app, letting them know what occurred in school. Because in this case, what happened, you have a fight in the school, things are contained quickly, the kids are bused back home, they go back into their communities. That same night, there's a shooting in the city. So we have to make sure that information is shared. That has to be a two-way street also, because the same thing could happen in the community where you have a fight the night before. That agency has to make sure the school is notified, because those kids the next day are going to be bused back into that school, back into a separate jurisdiction. So we have to make sure that that process is in place and that we're sharing that information in a timely manner. So how do we transition from identification to response? So once we have the assessment complete, we talked about the assessment really is the roadmap. It's the blueprint that kind of drives the decision-making process for the entire group, the entire team of stakeholders. That's when you sit down and you develop your comprehensive strategy. What's the next step in terms of prevention, intervention, or suppression? It has to be a team effort. It has to be a collaborative approach. Again, law enforcement plays a significant role, but we don't own the problem. We have to work together. Our response has to be a true team effort. The trust and open communications is paramount. If we can all pull the rope in the same direction at the same time, we certainly can have a huge impact on gang violence. So again, it comes back to that open communication, teamwork, collaboration, and sharing of intelligence. That's going to drive the decision-making model on what steps we're going to take in terms of combating the gang problem. So to kind of bring it back 360, everything we've talked about is shown here in this display. Safer schools. If we can truly share information across all disciplines in a timely and effective manner, we can eliminate those barriers that hinder information sharing. Again, sharing information is critical. Accountability, again, not just within law enforcement, everybody at the table has to be accountable, and we have to hold each other accountable. We all play a part, but together, if we can all work together, the outcomes are going to be much, much more fruitful. We have to foster an environment of trust, and I've kind of hit on that several times. That is key to communications. I will say one thing that on the trust part, when you start sharing information, once that's violated, it's hard to restore that trust. So when intelligence is shared, when you have those discussions, it's so important to keep that information confidential, because you can work weeks developing trust and you can ruin it in one day. Education to our key stakeholders is paramount. Again, early education to parents, to all of our stakeholders, including school staff, school administrators, and some of our social service providers, is absolutely critical. And it has to be real-time, relevant information specific to your area of responsibility. And then lastly, developing good response strategies based on the plan that we have. That's going to dictate what direction we go in terms of our response capabilities. That wraps it up for me. Again, thank you for joining the webinar today, and more importantly, thank you for what you do each and every day to keep our kids safe. And I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Okay, thank you so much, Monroe. Really appreciate the perspectives from both Deputy Commissioner and Director Gonzalez for varied and very impactful and appropriate commentary around this important issue. I do want to highlight just a couple of things before we get into the Q&As. I want to make sure before, just in case anyone drops off early, that there is a very insightful document attached to this presentation, and you can go to the NGC website. You can see there's a Gangs in Schools document that the National Gang Center put out earlier this year about responding to gangs in schools, a collaborative approach to school safety. I think it's an excellent resource. Additionally, there's a law enforcement official's guide to the OGJDP comprehensive gang model. It's a tremendous resource. It can be found on the National Gang Center's website, OGJDP's website, multiple places. So I just encourage you, there's a ton of resources to support you in terms of implementing many of these foundational ideas that both Monroe and Victor have identified. So with that, I want to go to the first question that was posed, and that was from Stan. And he asked, when a youth is tagged as gang involved, what rights do they forfeit? Once labeled as gang involved, do the schools have additional sanctions available? And I think we'll start with you, Deputy Commissioner, since you have had the oversight for that entire state SRO program, and then we'll work back to Victor with any thoughts on that.
So they certainly don't forfeit any rights in terms of their civil rights. If they're a part of a validated gang and they've been validated as a gang member, certainly we can collect intelligence in terms of their gang activity, as long as there's a criminal predicate and we've followed all the guidelines by the federal statute. But in terms of losing civil rights, certainly no. In terms of school, maybe Victor could speak more to that. I'm sure in terms of dress code, there's things that they can do in terms of wearing colors, wearing specific gang signs and symbols in terms of the disciplinary process. So Victor, I don't know if you could touch on that.
Yeah, some of the things that I've run across with some schools, and one specific school district for at least the last 15 years, they have a gang intervention process. So it's once they see something with a student, they're gonna bring it up to them. They're gonna pull them in. They're gonna contact the parents. It can be something as simple as we found a bandana. So they start to look at the gang-related behavior, and then with the policies that they have, they just roll out the policy. And then there's some kind of graduated, I guess, disciplines that they'll do with them. In one situation, they're not suspending. They're just bringing it to your attention. We're going to contact your parents, let them know what's going on. Let's pull them in for a conference. If they feel that they need to bring in law enforcement, then they'll bring in law enforcement to discuss that, because that's part of their process, and they have the option not to, especially if they don't want the kid documented. So there's a lot of little things that they have to look at. So sometimes put them in we have in here in-school suspension that can go up to 20 days in that specific district. They have an alternative placement that can be 30 to 45 days out, and then they have one that's 180. And when you sit there for 180 days for repeated gang-related activity, you have got to really have done some things to get sent to that placement. So the kids know we've been doing it for a long time. So in that situation, we have things that we're looking at, and it's the behavior when it comes down to it. And the more that they continue to break school policy, the more those disciplines are going to be kicked in by the school. But as far as anything else, that's about the extent of it. In other schools where they don't have that process, then it's up in the air. And I would highly recommend you don't have that type of approach. It has to be consistent so that the kids understand. Here on this campus, when they see Mr. Vic, when they see Mr. G, they know what time it is. It's like, G's here. You can keep it quiet, keep it off the campus. If you got an issue, take it to him, let him deal with it first. I always tell them, let me play with it. And once they let me do my thing, and then I go back and forth with different gangs and administrators, it's my job in that specific role to help keep things quiet. And let's do what we can not to have to go to the far lengths of just getting rid of kids just to get rid of kids. But I tell them all the time, if you make your bed, you won't have to lie in it. So don't come over here asking me to bail you out. We've already gone over this stuff. So policy, a process is huge in being able to curtail some of that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Victor and Monroe, for answering that question. And actually, Victor, your answer segues into the next question that John Waters asked about where does probation services fit into the intervention process. And, you talked about that graduated sanctions piece, and, there's a lot of informal probation and opportunities to kind of manage things in a very different way. Do you want to talk a little more about that in terms of how probation services fit in?
So here, we started something back in '99 called the Enhanced Gang Supervision Program, and that was when a student or a young person, a lot of students, were identified in a gang-related crime. They went through a specific court, and they were put on a specific caseload or it started as a specific group of probation officers that were working these kids that were getting caught up in gang-related crime. Those kids came to us as the referral source for the help out of our office, and then obviously those kids go to whatever school they go to. I think the biggest thing that you need to do with probation, when we started to work off the comprehensive gang model, which is a huge help for me in the beginning, all those years ago, was where do they fit? Because to me in those days, they were just locking them up. But when I started to understand what types of things what kinds of levers they could pull, did we need, there was no curfew time. Do we need an ankle monitor? Do we need to pull the parents in and pull the student in and pull the administrator in and the administrator understands what the sanctions are with these kids so that they could have a good conversation about what was going on. I think early on, the school has to be accepting of a probation officer. Sometimes they don't want them on campuses. And now here we are. I've been in this business 30-something years, and now we're going to have probation officers recently this year have been assigned to some of the schools to become a liaison to some of the school administrators to be able to get them help with what's going on with juvenile probation and being able to tighten the relationship between probation and schools. With our Enhanced Gang Supervision group, they have been very proactive in understanding the role of gang outreach and the understanding of prevention and intervention, that a lot of those POs, sometimes I'm like, okay, you're not the social worker, we are, stay in criminal justice. But we've come that far, being as long as we've been doing it here in Houston, that I have the luxury of being able to have those types of POs, and their leadership kind of echoes the same thing. But they need to be on our campuses as much as they can, but have a real understanding of why schools do what they do, and schools understanding why probation does what they do.
That's great. No, really appreciate that perspective. Monroe, anything to add on that question?
No, I would agree with Victor. They play a critical role, and they have to have a seat at the table as part of the stakeholder meetings. They can leverage certain powers through family court or through the courts on those specific probationers, programming, special needs. They are a tremendous power and a tremendous tool that can be used as part of your overall team approach, hopefully more towards the treatment and programming, but certainly if they're not meeting the conditions of probations, they can be brought back before the judge and sanctions can be placed. So they are critical players in the team effort.
That's great. Okay. We're going to move on to the next question, and this one's pretty deep. It's around recommendations for youth whose families are OGs and deeply involved with gang activities because they live and are related to the gang family. And it's really a struggle for at least this individual and many working within the community. So any thoughts around recommendations for working with those youth and families?
Let me break it down in two ways. I guess the short of it is, if you've got a parent who's very gang involved, he's an OG, he's running things, he's doing things on the street, and his son or daughter is been brought up to follow the same path, it's very, very difficult. My guess is many times across the state, even in Houston, when we've had those situations, law enforcement is usually already onto them and they're already investigating them, or they've had so many run-ins with them, they have to keep that specific parent or that gang on their radar. So they're always around, involved in something. And that can sometimes, that hurts the student, in my opinion, many times, because the student wants to live up to what his brothers, sisters, moms, dads, whatever it was that they did, because that's what you're supposed to do when you get put down. If you get put down and you're blessed in, or you went through the same initiation process, you're to be better than your parents. You're to be, the ultimate gang member. You got to get out there and do things. But you don't know that until you get involved with them. And so the second part of that is that I've run across in situations where I have parents come into the school and administrators freak out because they see this guy with all these tattoos. And like, oh man, what's up with this? And immediately the mindset goes into us, he's probably in prison, he probably did this, that, and the other, and you psych yourself out and you forget about understanding who he is as a parent. Because I've had many times where I've seen those types of fathers and mothers that come in all tatted up, and they're far away from it and want to be away from it. And even though they still may be struggling to step away from the lifestyle, doesn't mean that they want their kids involved. So how do you figure that out? When you have a process in place to bring a parent in to talk about gang-related activity with your son, that helps. If it takes that you got to go knocking on doors, a lot of times you got to go meet them on their areas, where they grow up, where they live. And sometimes that's scary for people, but you have to get out there and get to know who these parents are and really what's going on. I walked up in situations on the extreme. You see all the cameras everywhere. You see the pit bulls in the yard. You're like, okay, they don't want no help. You kind of just, you roll with it. They don't answer the door. They don't want to talk to you. And then you have the other ones that are very inviting, and they feel more comfortable on the porch. They feel more comfortable inside in the living room. Let's sit at the kitchen table. Come on inside, drink some Kool-Aid with me, eat some tacos with me. Let's just chop it up. Sometimes you've got to get out there and talk to those people, because at the end of the day, just because they used to bang or they look like they bang doesn't mean they want their kids in that. But they don't know any other way, so they struggle. And so any support that the school can provide to them will be a huge, huge asset to your campus, because sometimes those guys, if there's drama on your campus and you have those parents that are out there in the community that can pull a string for you, make a phone call, you'd be surprised how quickly you can de-escalate a situation because of who you know. In the school districts I've been in, I've been out there 15 years in both of them, and I know brothers and sisters and uncles, and so when I drop those names on the campus, the kids make me, you lying, you don't know. I said, hit them up, put them on the phone, let me talk to them. Then I get on the phone with them, and they're like, what's up, G? I said, man, what's up, man? It's your nephew over here. What's going down? He's like, man, Vic, hold on, man. Put him on the phone. So then he puts the kid back on the phone. He says, man, whatever that man tells you to do, you do it. Put him back on the phone. I get back on the phone. He says, it's done, Vic. Don't worry. And whatever else you need, get my number from him and you call me. So sometimes the relationship that you're setting up and trying to build can do some of those things. But that one that's already in it's going to stay in it. I live and die by the gun and the gang. It's tough. You're going to lose some. I lose a lot. I don't always win. I lose quite a bit sometimes.
Okay, that's really helpful. Monroe, you have anything to add on this?
No, I think Victor covered it well.
Okay, great. And Mina, I also want to feel free, Mina, Director of the National Gang Center, feel free to chime in with any thoughts you might have on any of these.
I will. I think all is
sure.
good right now.
Okay, so we got a couple. I'm gonna move it around a little bit. We got a couple other questions that have been consistent themes from some new questioners, and it's around where can we find gang symbols, tattoos, tags that we would see in our area? And another one is, can you provide sign clues or examples to look for in the school setting? So this, I think, a very appropriate question for the two of you in terms of how they can begin finding those indicators. I know, Victor, you talked about it a little bit in your piece, and you provided some examples, but in terms of finding specific to a particular community, any ideas of resources, maybe working with local law enforcement? Any thoughts there?
Local law enforcement is helpful, but one thing that I encourage, that if you're looking to keep it to your campus, you got to get in the locker rooms. You got to look at walls. You got to go in the bathrooms and the stalls. If there's courtyards where you have tables, go look at what they're drawing. Classwork, homework, notebooks, what's being written on a lot of the stuff that gets turned into teachers. What is some of that stuff? And if you're new to it, you're not always going to know, and this is where I come in handy with as a vendor. So getting with an agency that might be familiar with what's going on in your particular area with gangs. There's a gang outreach component, gang intervention component, youth violence-related program. Sometimes those people that they have working for them are a good source of information that you can invite onto your campus to kind of help things make more sense of what you got going on to get a better assessment. But I like to do my own. When I hit a campus, I want to know what's here. I know I have Southwest Cholos in the community. I know I have MS. I know I have LP. I know I've got Bloods. I know I've got Crips. But how many do I have on my campus? Are they active? How active are they? Are they little brothers? Are they sisters? Do they carry weight? Are they all having drama in the community? And is that drama coming over to the campus? Is it going to a football game? Is it going to a basketball game? You know, being able to have all that knowledge in-house really allows you to work for what is going on that campus. In one school district, I got 5 campuses, and 2 main campuses, 4 campuses are all around each other. But on one side of the campuses, I've got a lot of drama. On the other side, I don't have any. It's quiet, but I have some of the same gangs. So I encourage you to do a lot of your homework in-house. Talk to the students. Find somebody that can help you interpret some of the graffiti that you're finding on your campus, because then the only other option is you got to partner up with local law enforcement and see how comfortable you guys get with sharing that information back and forth.
Great. Now, this really does beg the question. You know, in your community, Victor, you have been a mainstay, and you've been able to provide that connect for so many individuals that are trying to you know, address this very important issue. And I just wonder if you have any nuggets, any thoughts for individuals on this webinar in terms of how, you know, many jurisdictions don't have the Victor Gonzalez. They don't have the VIX. So, how, you know, thoughts on how to help establish and create that Victor Gonzalez of the local community.
You have those champions in every community. That I do know. I wasn't always the person I am now. I mean, I grew up around the mess, but see, I grew up around the times of the drug dealers and the prison gangs that were on the street. So I knew a lot of that because in my day growing up, it was the prison gangs around the streets. You had neighborhood stuff. You were from this neighborhood or that neighborhood. Then you knew where to go, where not to go, and if you went, be ready because something could pop off. But see, I had to learn this stuff. I had to learn what Houston's was, and we're a big city. You know, we're 4 million when you push the county, 2 million in the city, and each part of the city is different. And the only way I was able to continuously understand what was going on is that I had to be in it. And when I came from the nonprofit, I worked in nonprofit for 13, 14 years in one part of the city, and when I got recruited to go to the mayor's anti-gang office, I wanted to go another area. And I had to infiltrate myself. I had to get in there. I had to get on the ground, and I had to get out there and understand what was going on. And guess where I started? At the schools. It was at the schools, the parks, and the apartment complexes or the projects. And you have to be able to get out there and talk to people to understand what's going on so that you can become that expert in your area. But it starts with a champion, somebody that really cares about their community, cares about the kids. You can learn this information if you put yourself in the right positions, especially on a school campus, to work from campus out to community, because community will take you right back to campus. So I encourage, if there's a champion on your team and on your campus and your community, latch onto that person and figure out how you can move forward to have a wealth of knowledge. because there's a lot of people out there. I'm not the only one here. I've been able to build 10 people, and then with the comprehensive gang model, doing our intervention teams, I call them gang violence reduction teams. Here in Houston, I have meetings. I have 5 of them, and in each meeting, I got 15, 20 people. So I've got 15, 20 people that are interested in working gangs and working the kids that we have from those most violent gangs that are causing the most trouble, and we're all talking. And there they become very, very knowledgeable just participating in those teams. And when they go back to their agencies, they're becoming now the liaisons and the experts in their own respected agencies. But you got to get out there if you really want to do this work.
That's great. Thank you, Victor. I think the next question I'd like to ask Deputy Commissioner Hudson to address initially. It's in terms of perception. That when a youth is labeled or tagged as gang involved, the idea that they're exposed to additional searches or limitations around clothing, school activities, and interviews based on gang involved label, meaning like clothing activities like at dances or rival school sports events, that sort of thing. Any thoughts that you might have, Monroe, around that, the labeling and additional exposure to searches, that sort of thing, and then we'll hear from Victor on this.
Yeah, and then Victor may be able to, again, add on the school side in terms of their administrative capabilities, but from a law enforcement perspective, going back to a few questions ago, just because you're a gang member, you certainly don't give up certain civil liberties or civil rights. You still have to have a reasonable suspicion or probable cause to go up and detain someone and search them for weapons. But again, going back to the administrative side, certainly schools can have much stricter rules in terms of search for public safety reasons, coming in sporting events, scanning people as they come through the gate. But from strictly from a law enforcement perspective, you still have to have probable cause to search someone and pat them down for a weapon. You have to believe that they're a threat to you, the officer, or a threat to the public. So just because they may have a blue bandana on and they're a member of a validated gang, certainly doesn't give you the right just to go up and detain them and frisk them.
Yeah, that's great. Victor, do you want to add any thoughts?
Yeah, when it comes, I'm reading here and I'm following the chat here, looking at activities like dances and school sporting events. I think to echo what Lieutenant was saying is that you have to make sure that you understand the identifiers. I'll give you an example. We have been having some issues on the campus one week, and the 2 schools are from the same school district, and they're probably a football field across the street from each other, and they're going to have this big gang, but we started having gang issues. So immediately, red flags, we had a couple fights on campus, it went off campus, then it led to a couple shootings. So you already know, it's Friday night, we're about to have a football game, and law enforcement's like, we fixing to have some shootings out here if we're not careful. And then you got the administrators are a little hyped up because the kids are talking about certain things, and then there's stuff floating around on social media. We had some guys try to come in on one side of the stadium, and the administrators were all over the gang stuff, and they're like, no, not here. You're not coming over here with that flag, with those rosaries, with all these colors. That's not happening. All right, cool, miss, we're going to leave. They went to the other side of the stadium where the administrators were a little more lax, and they ended up on the rival side where they shouldn't have been. They got in. Nobody paid attention to their colors. They got in, and they didn't take but 30 minutes, and they were fighting in the stands because the rivals were over there throwing up gang signs, and the rivals got pissed off. They threw their signs, and before you knew it, you had a bunch of fights. Then we had to clear that. Then you got to clear the parking lot. Then you got to wait to make sure there's no shootings in the community. The understanding of what you have is so important that it goes with you everywhere you go when you're a school administrator, when you're working in a school setting. Because dances, throwing up gang signs and doing certain types of dances, certain songs, if you're not in tune and you're not familiar with what's going on in your community or on your campus, you're going to get caught off guard every time. It's just automatic. It just happens because we're not taking it seriously. They're just a bunch of kids. That's the trend. That's this. That's that. While that may be so, we still have to be cautious because some of these kids nowadays, Lieutenant mentioned earlier, cliques. I've got kids bouncing around in so many different cliques, and that mentality is go hard or go home. Get that money. And so I'm going to give my money however I got to give my money. And with that comes an attitude of I don't want to follow rules. I don't want to follow authority. I don't want anybody with authority to tell me nothing. I don't care if you're the principal. I'm gonna do what I want. And if we're not staying on top of these things, these kids think they can do whatever they want. And then when you go to a football game or a basketball game, you're bringing your homeboys that don't go to school, and that makes it even a bigger issue. So being able to have that inside knowledge on what's really going on, you can really curtail and prevent a lot of things from happening. But you got to have it.
That's
So
great.
I think Victor hit on some key points there, having very specific threat information related to a specific gang at a specific event. Certainly that opens up the avenue for doing pat-down searches and stuff like that. But like Victor says, you got to have that threat information in order to take action on it.
That's great. Thank you both for that. I think we're going to move on to the next question from Cheryl Stokes. Is there a central location to find intervention programs specifically for gang-involved youth? And I'm going to ask Nina to speak to this in a minute, but I do want to just say, generally speaking, we have OJJDP's Model Programs Guide. You can find that at ojjdp.gov, and that really focuses on over 300 evidence-based juvenile justice and youth programs from prevention, intervention, and reentry. So I think many of them are, involve, deeper end youth. I think that they could be applicable to gang-involved youth. I don't know. Amina will talk about the specific gang-involved repository, but that's a general resource that we have. And the National Institute of Justice has a crimesolutions.gov website, and it's exactly that, crimesolutions.gov, and it really focuses on programs and practices, a program being a specified set of activities carried out according to guidelines to achieve a defined purpose, and a practice being a general category of program strategies or procedures that show similar characteristics with regard to the issues they address and how they address them. And crimesolutions.gov looks at corrections and reentry, courts, crime and crime prevention. It goes into section on juveniles. I think those may be resources, Cheryl, that could help in terms of supporting the identification of evidence-based intervention programs that could support gang-involved youth minimization, if you will. And then, Amina, I don't know if you have additional thoughts to add on to those resources, but I wanted to ask.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Scott. So on the National Gang Center website, under the What Works menu, we have something called the Strategic Planning Tool, and within that we have a program matrix, and there's a list of over 100 programs, and they're interrelated, or they're matrix by age group. And what we do is we look for programs that we know that work with gang-involved youth or kids in the deep end of the system, chronic delinquency. And through that, we describe the program, the age group, the risk and protective factors that those programs address, and then we list the literature and the evaluation. We do that through our own research, and we also look at Crime Solutions. We look at model programs. We look at a couple other NEREP, National Repository, the one on the Department of Health, and the U.S. Department of Education. All these different agencies and universities have their own list of evidence-based programs, and we go through those and we pull the ones that we know through research work with gang-involved youth. So that is on our website, and we'll post that link here in just a minute.
That's great. Okay, Victor or Monroe, any additional thoughts on that one?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So the one other question looks like that we haven't addressed yet has to do with tribal schools that operate under limited funding and have, I'm just reading the note, struggles with needed resources and including adequate law enforcement resources. Noting that the reservations are a prime recruiting ground for gangs. Any recommendations for working with tribal schools? And I guess the general question is working with jurisdictions in general that may have limited funding and resources. Any thoughts around that? I don't know. We can open it up to either of you.
At one time, I was up in Minnesota, and I went up to a site where they wanted me to talk a little bit about gangs in schools, and we went through it. And it was sad to see that there was limited resources. And sometimes when there was resources, and I haven't worked a tribal community like I've done here in Houston, so I can't speak on it, but I can just go off of what I've come to know when there's a site that doesn't have a lot of help. Sometimes you've got to step outside your community and see what help is available, and start looking at how maybe other folks did get up to the point of creating resources, because at the end of the day, we've got to want the resources, find the avenues in which to be able to gain those resources, and sometimes there's a lot of grants out there that people don't know about. And there may be some things that you can do from your perspective to be able to gain access to that money and some of the resources that come with it. I know when we first got the comprehensive gang model, we were doing a lot of things, and I was kind of doing what I was doing on my end, and police and probation did what they did, but it wasn't until we grasped the hold of the model that it kind of gave me a better idea of what we could do and where I could work from, because at that point, I didn't think I had a lot of resources as big as Houston was. The problem was I had to want to go out and reach out to them, and they had to want to work a gang member. And a lot of agencies were scared to work gang members because they didn't know what a gang member was bringing other than what they had seen on TV or what they read in whatever book or movie they saw, where they think gang members are all murderers and do what they do, and they're not going to want to listen to anybody. So it took a lot of training, a lot of conversations, and then our office started seeking grants, and once we started to open that, the floodgates came, and we were able to learn a lot of things. But I think any community has to want to address gangs, and you've got to want to reach out to something that's outside of your norm. I never wanted to talk to cops. Cops didn't like me. I ain't like them. And I had to learn over the years that not all police officers are the way you may have seen them when you were growing up doing what you were doing. Not all probation officers are trying to lock up all your homeboys that you lost and went to prison. Even though I knew it was their fault for doing what they did, that they got a PO and ended up in prison, you just start to develop this kind of negative connotation of agencies and people that sometimes prevents you from even having even the remote possibility of gaining some resources to your community. So sometimes you got to step out. And I know that may be hard. And again, I don't know all the factors that come with the reservations, but I know they had some of the same issues. And we're talking about some of the issues we're talking about today were some of the things I was talking about with them. And they were able to say, you know what, we didn't think about it that way. And within their culture, they were able to come up with some things. I don't know what's going on now with them, but it just seems to me you've got to want to reach out. You've got to want to receive.
That's great. And I think Mina has a few thoughts on this question. Mina?
I just wanted to say that we at the National Gang Center are quite well aware of the limited resources in tribal areas on these issues and in a few other, the rural areas. And what we do, we don't have anything on the website that we can just hand you, but if we get contacted individually, then we will do everything we can to consult with you and try to find you referrals to resources in that area, or as Victor said, or outside of the box around the area, and that's where we would go with that. So, one other thing before I turn it back over to Scott, can you send to the next email? I just wanted to let you know that if you are looking for the other webinar that Scott and I referred to, you can find it on our National Gang Center website, and the slide will show you where to go. It's under webinars in our resource tools, or in our library under webinars, and this one will be available, and the one we did in August will be available. So thank you, and now I'll turn it back over to Scott.
Great, thanks, Mina. And thank you, Victor and Monroe. I think this has been a tremendous opportunity to really showcase the kind of partnerships we endeavor at OGJDP, provide, including a TTA provider, that's the National Gang Center, and really incorporating law enforcement and community-based organizations and communities, to really identify successful strategies and implement programs to really effectuate change throughout the nation. So hopefully you found this to be a helpful resource. I think that this really is just the tip of the iceberg. The goal here is really to wet your whistle, so to speak, in terms of resources that are available. Certainly National Gang Center and OGJDP have a ton of resources at your fingertips, and certainly we're available to support you as further questions come up. So I don't know if Victor and Monroe, if you have any closing comments?
No, but just thank you for your time. Hopefully you found some value in it, and if I can ever be assistance, if you go through Mina or Scott, certainly feel free to reach out to me. But thank you so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon.
Great.
Likewise, I like to echo that. I know sometimes the time frame doesn't allow you to get all your answers to everything about this topic, but certainly you can reach out to me as well through Mina or Scott. I do a lot of work with the Gang Center, so feel free to reach out, and I'll get to you as quick as I can and answer any questions that you might have to kind of give you a better idea of what it is that you're looking for. So, but thanks again for sticking around on a Friday.
Thanks again. So I think we're going to yield 3 minutes back to everyone with the goal that you'll take the time to then complete the online evaluation. So I think it's a fair trade. Really want to thank everyone for the time today, and appreciate the support.